On the first full day of my recent Greenland Arctic expedition cruise, this ominous notice appeared in the daily program. It required us to attend a mandatory, written in capital letters no less, meeting at 5 p.m. that day. Now, having been on 4 previous expedition cruises to Antarctica, the Arctic and Galapagos, I knew and was ready to expect this meeting, but most passengers did not. And many were kind of confused because we'd had the muster drill, which most people thought was the only mandatory requirement you go on a cruise. Now, concern actually grew because the expedition director then made an announcement saying that failure to attend that meeting would have significant implications for everybody and certainly individuals on the cruise. So this got me thinking, I should really talk about this and 5 other things that I only found out about after boarding when I started going on expedition cruises. Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge and I make it fun and easy to discover, plan and enjoy incredible cruise vacations. So, what was that meeting all about then? It's a make or break mandatory talk about the rules of the region. So on my Arctic trips, I've heard about the ACO rules. So that's the Association of Arctic Expedition Cruise Operators. In Antarctica, it was IATO, rules of the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. And in Galapagos, it was actually the national park rules because Galapagos is within the national park. The lines I've found always check attendance, and not going means not being allowed to go on any of the off-ship outings during the cruise. So these talks lay out what we all must do, can do, and importantly cannot do on the landings. And the rules that most people hear for the very first time after they've boarded are incredibly strict and limiting, which most people don't realize. So unlike when we've all been on a Caribbean or Alaska cruise where we can just head off the ship, we can go and do whatever we want, this is not the case on expedition. So rules include things like having any clothes that are going to be worn off the ship being screened. Often they're vacuumed sometimes, that's sometimes mandatory, to make sure, basically they aren't carrying seeds and bugs. Rules like staying within a defined area, which in the Arctic, you've got polar bear guards encircling that area, walking on very specific paths, not even stepping off the path to take a photo. In the Galapagos, for example, rules on what distance to stay away from wildlife, not taking anything, even a feather or a pebble back to the ship, and how, one mustn't leave anything behind. So for example, even if you're taking a tissue out of your pocket, making sure that it doesn't blow away, for example. They also talk about you can't take any food out with you. There are no toilet facilities, so if you need the bathroom, the only option is to basically head back on a Zodiac to the ship, and more on Zodiacs later. Now, when these rules are being revealed, I also see many people surprised at how stern the lecture is and how restrictive it is once you're on land. So that's a big aha once people are on board. But the next topic, also revealed once you're on board and usually uncovered at the same talk, upsets many people. So once on board, you're told bluntly that the advertised itinerary that you've bought is at best a hope. And day to day, that we're going to be told where the next ship will go to next because conditions in the regions change, and so they basically decide day by day where they're going to go. Now, unlike a regular cruise, where changes to a Caribbean, a Mediterranean or Alaska cruise that we booked is really, really unusual, it's revealed once you're on board an expedition cruise that this will be the norm. It is not unusual, it is the norm. So let me give you some examples based on my recent trip to Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. So the advertised itinerary had us boarding in Kasalungaquaq, that's in Greenland. So before heading across first to explore the Canadian Arctic. But the sea ice in the Baffin Sea between the two made crossing absolutely impossible. So we stayed instead in Greenland and we sailed north to the line, having to reschedule trips that were planned for later. They had to find new places for us to visit along the way. So once we could eventually find a way to cross into Canada, when we got to Canada, a massive storm was passing through. There was thick ice where we were due to go. So they scrapped pretty much all of the advertised itinerary for Canada anyway, and we took refuge in a place called Erik Fjord. They found somewhere for us to hike up to a beautiful frozen lake. And then the next day, because the storm was still there, we went, instead of where we were supposed to be going, to Admiralty Fjord, where they scouted a new landing in Adams Sound. They then negotiated a stop at a settlement of about 900 people called Arctic Bay, who kindly laid on some cultural immersion. So everything was kind of different to the advertised schedule. On other days, even when we had an announced schedule for that day, we had a program, it would get thrown in the air and reworked because, for example, the captain turned the ship around because polar bears were spotted. which is a good thing to do. Or he decided one day that we were going to go on an totally unplanned Zodiac ride in Crocker Bay because we were passing and it was a beautiful day. So I've seen on all my expedition trips, many passengers, they'll get quite stressed when they find out once on board that they're not going to get what was advertised and it isn't happening. So on an Antarctica trip, for example, last season, I was contacted recently by someone who'd booked an itinerary after seeing my South Georgia videos, but they were left totally distraught when the line cancelled sailing there due to rough seas and they missed out seeing all that incredible wildlife, the huge big penguin colonies. It hadn't crossed their mind and it hadn't been made clear before going that such dramatic changes were possible. I don't think expedition cruises make it clear when people are booking that the itinerary is and must be a hope and a guideline. None of the 5 cruises that I've done to date as expedition cruises have ever run to the advertised itinerary. But even those passengers that realize that or have learned to be adaptable and flexible, they weren't aware of this next issue before they got on board because it wasn't spoken about before boarding. On my first expedition cruise, which was to the Antarctica, I quickly realized that not enough is made before going around the need to be active and to be mobile to get the absolute most from these costly trips. First of all, because of the Zodiacs, it is really unusual for an expedition ship to dock. It's almost always moored off land. These are pretty remote places, and then Zodiacs are used to get the passengers to and from land. Even embarkation and disembarkation on both my Galapagos and that recent Greenland cruise were actually by Zodiacs. The ship wasn't docked. Now, Zodiacs are small inflatable boats. They hold around about 10 people and they require climbing off the ship into them and can often be bobbing up and down quite a lot. Many of the landings that one makes on expedition are wet landings. This means clambering off the Zodiac into water, and I've seen many people struggling on every trip, getting on them, getting off them. The second reason for being active is because while some of the excursions are leisurely Zodiac rides, in the Canadian Arctic, that one I mentioned about going to the glacier, or many around icebergs and beautiful bays in Antarctica, the landings and the off-ship experiences like that are really active. Most of them are strenuous hikes. So on that recent Arctic trip, we were clambering and hiking up big hills to view glaciers. We were clambering over steep rocks to see waterfalls. When I was in Antarctica, we're going through ice and snow hills to see penguin colonies or incredible glaciers. In the Galapagos, it was over really uneven ground. On all my expedition cruises, I came across people that had not realized quite how strenuous these landings and hikes were going to be. And many ended up having to skip some of the best sights and the best experiences because they just didn't know that before they got on board. The other activity that people don't know about until they're bored is snorkeling in Galapagos. Probably I would say half the best highlights I saw were in the water. Amazing fish, Galapagos penguins, Galapagos seals, sharks, rays, and so on. Now, many people on that trip had no idea until they were on it that this snorkeling was so key to the trip. And a couple of people told me they would have actually reconsidered going if they'd known before. So on every expedition cruise, by the way, that I've been on, there has actually been someone in a wheelchair, normally traveling with friends or family. Now, talking to them, in most cases, they hadn't really appreciated they wouldn't be able to get off the ship at all because it's just so complicated. Saying that, on that Greenland cruise, over the 18 days we were out there, the crew did actually take the guy in the wheelchair out once in a place called Disco Bay when we were cruising around icebergs because the sea was really, really calm. On an 18-day Ponant Antarctica expedition, they also arranged for the gentleman in the wheelchair to be taken on a landing one day in a really calm bay in his wheelchair so they could put him on and say that he'd actually been to the continent. But the rest of the time, because of the complexity and the zodiacs and stuff and the nature of the landings, people who had no mobility had to stay on the ship. So while mobility and agility definitely come as a surprise to many people once they're bored, so does the wildlife, or certainly the nature of what you're going to see versus what the brochures, social media, and cruise websites suggest. Everyone I met on an expedition cruise is expecting to see the bucket list and the iconic wildlife shown in all those marketing materials. So in the Arctic, people are expecting to see polar bears. In Antarctica and the Arctic, whales breaching or enormous humpback whale tails rising up close to the ship and so on. So the implication of all the materials is we're going to see them all. We're going to see them up close and we're going to get amazing pictures, even just with our smartphones, because they're going to kind of be within touching distance, if that's the right expression. Now, once on board, at the start of the trip, I have always been told very clearly that while they will try and see things like polar bears, whales, seals, and so on, it's absolutely a game of chance. It's a lot of luck. There is no guarantee that you will see these things that you're expecting to see, which of course, once I say it, is really obvious because they can't get wildlife to appear on request, but that's not really stressed before you go. It is once you're on board. Also, by the way, I found once you've encountered things like polar bears and whales, they have actually been really far away because the ship has to, under the regulations, stay some distance away. So the sighting can often be fleeting. I've sometimes missed some of the sightings by the time I've got out on deck. Now, on the Greenland Arctic trip, to give an example, we did see polar bears. In fact, across the trip, we actually saw 7 polar bears. I only eventually saw 6 of them because I missed one of them. But we were on the ship. They were on land because landing when polar bears are around is prohibited because they're so dangerous. All of the sightings were at least a kilometre away. That's about 1,000 yards. So it took binoculars, which many lines like mine provide, or a camera with a very long lens to see beyond a small white dot in the distance. So I had a long kind of 350mm lens, and even that wasn't great. They were still kind of really quite small. The same has been my experience with whales in both the Arctic and Antarctica. Whales often do come closer to the ship themselves, but the ship is supposed to kind of keep a distance if they spot it. So it's tempted to kind of be puffs from orcas in the distance from the spout, or maybe a humpback whale in the distance with their tails, which with the good camera that I had, I did get decent shots. So exciting as it was to see them, I kind of realized you just don't get up as close as the images suggest when you're booking. You're kind of expecting to get amazing close-ups and see these animals up really close. You just don't, and you realize that once you're on board. On the positive side, though, most expedition cruise lines have onboard photographers and videographers who have incredible lenses way beyond what I've got. And so you will be able to get a better video or photographs of the sightings, which are either included in your fare or you have to pay extra for. On the upside, though, I would say in Antarctica, penguins I got really close to. They have no fear of humans. In South Georgia, on the beaches, I got really close to elephant seals, and I didn't need kind of big lenses to see them. In the Galapagos, you get really close to birds, the giant tortoises. So while I don't think expedition cruisers do a good job at setting expectations about wildlife on board, they absolutely, though, do not in the next area, I feel. And many passengers, especially those used to kind of onboard life on regular cruises to places like the Caribbean, are expecting something quite different, and they only discover once they're on board that it's not the case. Because it's called a cruise, most people seem to expect a usual cruise entertainment program. However, once you're on board, they soon learn that the focus and main entertainment is actually enrichment lectures, recaps, and briefings. So for example, on that most recent trip, I counted up at least 16 lectures covering history, climate, wildlife, culture, geography. And then on top of that, we usually had a daily recap of what we'd actually seen that day and a briefing on where we would be going to next with background about what we would see and what to expect. The evening entertainment was literally a pianist or a guitarist playing after dinner, or some nights instead there would be a panel with the polar bear guards asking questions. There was another one with senior officers. So in reality, that evening entertainment were really kind of enrichment talks. And that's important to understand because instead of an entertainment team, you realize once you get on board, is an expedition team. And these are subject experts. So across the day, there's not a program of events because there's no one to run them. And though those expedition team are out on all the landings with guests, so on expedition cruises, at most, you'll perhaps have one trivia per day. You might have the occasional cooking or dining events. So we had a German sausage and beer lunch, for example. Of course, you'll have a captain's welcome and farewell, maybe some fitness classes. People who like lots going on and being entertained find it a bit of shock once they're on board because they're expecting a typical cruise program packed with events and shows. But once they're on board, they realize that just doesn't exist. It's much lower key. But for some like me, actually, the lack of entertainment, especially in the evening, even if a surprise, ends up not being an issue because of the next thing that people quickly discover once they're on board. Expedition cruising is tiring and days can be erratic, as becomes clear once you're on board. First of all, landings will often start early in the morning. So we had many from 7:30 a.m., 8 a.m. and other cruises I've been on, it was even as early as 6:30 a.m. Because on the ship, regions limit how many people can be on land at any one time. So in the Arctic and Antarctica, that's only 100 people. I think it might be 50 in Galapagos. As most expedition ships that go have at least 200 people, so in the Arctic and the Antarctica, 100 go off for 2 hours or so, they come back and the next 100 go. So that takes a good 4 or 5 hours. The ship is then going to sail to another location of interest a couple of hours away, and that repeats that whole process. To fit all that in means early starts and long days of activity. So this secondly means that recaps and briefings only take place in the evening before dinner. So there's very limited downtime. And also, as I mentioned, it's quite active once you're out there. The other reason is, the sights are amazing. The ship has spotted amazing icebergs, whales, or polar bears. So I also find on an expedition cruise, when you're not on a landing, you're actually going to be spending a lot of time out on deck looking at the sights, what's going on. So that's tiring as well because you're basically outstanding. Fourthly, if the crew spots something of interest, those polar bears, whales, unusual sights, they make an announcement, no matter the time of day or night, to alert us to it. So on this last trip, we had them at 11:30 p.m. at night, a couple of nights, because they spotted some incredible icebergs. It was 5:30 a.m. in some mornings, so they spotted polar bears. It's a once-in-a-lifetime trip, all this money, so turning off the announcements and missing potentially sightings like this is just not an option. But it does get really tiring, because, as I said again, those landings are very active. And I don't think just how tiring it is not made clear until you're on board, where you're kind of told you're not here for a holiday. If you want a holiday, take a holiday afterwards. But despite all of these issues that you realize, it is an incredible experience. So join me on this video to see how the trip went, how I coped with all these changes, and what I experienced, starting with one amazing surprise. See you over there.